I'm Aaron David Miller, and this is Carnegie Connects. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world. I truly hope you are safe, sound, and above all, very healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a set of virtual discussions, at least for now, of issues of critical importance to America and to the world. I'm pleased this morning and honored to host Brett McGurk, Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa at the National Security Council. Brett, it's great to see you again, and welcome to Carnegie Connects.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me here.
Terrific. We have a lot of ground to cover, but before we get to the granular, the kind of tour of the region, I want to get some thematic altitude and talk about some big picture stuff. In an interview you gave last November, I believe, you reflected on your tenure under maybe four presidents, and talked about the challenge of overcommitting and overpromising in the region. So I wonder if you look back now, you've been in the job about a year, if you were to identify keeping that theme of the challenge of overcommitting and overpromising with respect to American credibility and interests in the region, if you were to identify the administration's key success during that period, and as well, I've worked for half a dozen administrations, nobody's perfect, its greatest failing, looking back before we go forward, how would you do it? How would you identify success and failure?
Well, we've been here a year, so the Middle East, I think, it's difficult to answer that question. I mean, George Mitchell famously said in diplomacy, he had 700 days of failure, 1 day of success. I mean, that's kind of the nature of diplomacy. So I don't want to categorize it like that, but the thematic question you asked, I think, is an important one, because it's true. Over my fourth administration I've worked in, and I think since 9/11, over 2 decades, I think the United States of America has pursued objectives in the Middle East that are maximalist and probably unachievable, from regional transformation to democratization through regime change, multiple regime changes, these kind of maximalist policies that every administration has set. And I think that is a danger, because you risk overcommitment, you risk unintended consequences, you risk just overtaking the bandwidth of the President of the United States. And so we have really come in with a focus driven by our guidance from President Biden, a focus on very practical objectives. So focusing on the situation that we inherited, the very difficult situation that we inherited, consulting very quietly over the first 100 days of this administration with every capital in the region, and setting objectives and policies in coordination with our partners that we think aligns our ends and means. So it is really getting back to the basics of statecraft, recognizing we're a global power with global priorities, but that this region is interwoven with important and vital American interests. It is too volatile, too important to simply disengage, and we are not disengaging. But I think I'm sometimes asked, are we deprioritizing the Middle East region? That's really the wrong question. You have to ask, what are we trying to do? I was here in the Bush administration, in which we were engaged, obviously, in the war in Iraq, taking casualties every single day. I lived that every single day. I lived through the surge, a policy that I supported at the time. And I think if you look at that time till now, obviously it's quite different. And I think that's important. We are not trying to pursue a transformation of this region. We are trying to pursue very important, vital American interests in a way that aligns our ends and means and our commitments and our capabilities. And so we can get into some of those details, but it's a very important, I think, thematic point about how to approach this region. You will not see from the Biden administration announcements of setting grandiose objectives without a basis of facts and a factual foundation. An example, and I don't want to go on, but it's important if you look at presidential history, because a kind of counterexample to that is often JFK and we're going to the moon. And if you study that decision, he had a study that was done, commissioned by his vice president, but with the top scientists at the time, that said, Mr. President, we can go to the moon. Here's how you do it. Here's what we need for rockets. Here are the costs. Here would be the resources. It's not without risk, but it's very achievable. And I think that is a charge that I give to my team and my students when I was teaching. But also, this is coming from the president on down. When we set policies, we want to make sure that they are undergirded by a foundation of understanding and facts and doing things that we can achieve.
Yeah, well, I'm all for that. But I want to return to this issue of I guess the most resonant debate among Middle East watchers is between those who argue that the U.S. is doing too much and those who argue that it's not doing enough. The less lobby, if I could call it that, argues that domestic priorities, fixing America's broken house, weaning ourselves off of Arab hydrocarbons, the rise of China, and the notion that most of the problems in this region are beyond America's capacity to repair, which you essentially, I think, implicitly acknowledge. The More lobby, however, argues that we have critical interests there. You have humanitarian catastrophes from one end of the region to the other, unresolved conflicts that impinge and undermine American credibility. So where is the balance, Brett, between doing too much on one hand and not doing enough on the other? Because governing is about choosing.
I think that's a false choice, though. And I think you have to look at our interest in the nature of this very important region. You can look at the waterways of the region from the Suez Canal to the Bab el-Mandeb to the Straits of Hormuz. If you want to say the Middle East doesn't matter, we had a couple weeks with a tanker basically blocking the Suez Canal, almost shut down the global economy. So I think these are kind of vital interests that are interwoven in this region. And of course, trying to ensure as best we can, we have no more failed states in this region. The failed states over the last 2 decades have opened up vacuums that are filled by extremist actors and proxy battlegrounds from all across the region, which is extremely dangerous and destabilizing, and also ultimately comes back to bite us. I sometimes give the example early in the Trump administration when we couldn't bring laptops on airplanes. That was a threat that was coming out of Syria, a very serious threat. I want to try to make sure that those types of threats cannot emerge from this very important region. I think that's a very achievable goal. So it's not less or more. It's the fact that, again, if we try to pursue maximalist goals, we will be overinvested. If we try to focus on what our interests are, I think we can actually get it right. And that's what we're working to do.
Okay, you touched on the key theme. Policy is just another way of describing the search or the pursuit of a set of objectives, ensuring that you have the means and capacity to achieve those objectives. So if you had to define, I have my favorite 3. I'll identify them if we need to, but I have my favorite 3 core American interests in the region. If you had to identify, and you have to distinguish between vital and discretionary, what we must have as opposed to what it would be nice to have. So if you had to identify American interests, core American interests in the region, what would they be?
Well, I don't want to categorize them from kind of prioritization, but number one, we're going to make sure Iran can never have a nuclear weapon, because that would be incredibly destabilizing to our national security interests and our friends and allies across the Middle East region, let alone what Iran could do around the world. We want to make sure that the waterways that I just mentioned for international commerce remain safe, secure, and that's something that obviously we focus on every day. And we want to focus on stability in the region. Without vacuums opening up in which threats can emerge against us, our allies and partners all around the world. I mean, those are basically kind of some basic, important, vital objectives that we're pursuing. But through diplomacy and working to make sure that we don't have new wars breaking out in the Middle East as best we can, takes an awful lot of maintenance and work, just the blocking and tackling of basic diplomacy. I mean, 3 themes that we work on every day. Deterrence, first of all. Diplomacy without deterrence starts to border on appeasement. And we're very focused on deterring threats from extremist groups from Iran around the region. Integration. One of the positive trends in the region, from the Abraham Accords to the healing of the Gulf Rift to the polarization between, say, Turkey and UAE, which we have seen, that integration, those dialogues that are going on are very important, something that we're encouraging. And even the discussions between Gulf states and Iran, while being very realistic about what this means, I think it gives you a tool to try to avoid miscalculations, while being very realistic. And de-escalation where we can. We want to de-escalate tensions where we can through diplomacy, but with a combination of deterrence. So, I think we've said it about right. We're not going to make everybody happy, but it's a difficult, volatile region. It's interwoven with our vital interests, and we're trying to pursue a straight course.
I mean, if the word vital pertains to the security and prosperity of the United States, what are the vital interests that we have? You mentioned water, although you didn't mention oil. We may be weaning ourselves off of Arab hydrocarbons, but the rest of the world is going to be dependent on them for many years to come. You mentioned the notion of, you didn't say the emergence of a regional hegemon with a nuclear weapon. That's the way I would phrase it, which is critically important to conflict in the region. Iran is the one issue, probably the only issue in the region that could precipitate a regional conflict in which the United States could become involved. And then there's the issue of protecting the homeland. Those will be my three. Because each of them pertains to the security and prosperity of the United States. There's a lot in the region that's discretionary. Would be nice to have, but whether or not we're going to get there, I don't know. Before we turn to the regional tour I want to take with you, a couple more big picture questions. Values and interests. John McCain famously said our values are our interests and our interests are our values. Previous administration more or less emptied the frame of American foreign policy of most of its moral and ethical sensibilities. How would you describe the Biden administration's conception of how human rights figures and American values figures in our policy?
David, just to dovetail just on the past conversation, I think your summary is apt, and I think very close to what I laid down. Look, energy price pressures, oil, natural gas, are a central component of policy in this region. There's no question. And it's something that obviously we deal with. And it's particularly right now, given the global economic recovery, as we begin to emerge from COVID, which is ongoing. I think will be ongoing through the coming year at least. That's a central component, obviously, of the policy. And it affects our domestic economy and affects our position in the world. It affects our economic growth. So that is, I think, interwoven with our discussions, particularly in the Gulf, as are, however, values. I'm glad you asked this question. Look, I think, Jake has put it this way, Jake Sullivan, that the question of values and human rights is at the table when we are having discussions about our national security interests in this region. That alone is unique. And that is how American diplomats wear our values on our sleeve, together with our handshake and representing the American people. That's very important. Does that mean that human rights and values overtake every other issue? No, but it's a part of the conversation. If I can give an example of Egypt, I think we are the first administration that has not issued a national security waiver for our annual allocation of foreign military financing. There's a conversation we're having with the Egyptians right now. We just had a conversation with senior officials in Cairo yesterday. At the same time, Egypt is critical to the security of Israel. Coming out of the Gaza war in May, Egypt has played a critical job, not only helping to wind down that conflict in 11 days when it had all the ingredients to last for months, and also working to ensure we have some stability in Gaza in the wake of it. That is central to our discussions with the Egyptians. All the issues on the Horn of Africa, which Jeff Feltman had been working on, now David Satterfield just took over. Jeff was just in Cairo working on these issues. So, it's complex and multifaceted, but the issues of values and human rights is central to our discussion as we have these conversations. I'll just say, I saw President Sisi with Jake last fall, and the first part of the meeting was focused on human rights. So, it's central to our administration, it's central to our approach, and I think that's what makes us unique.
Yeah. I mean, we have a foreign policy of which human rights should play a significant role. We need to be consistent in the way we stand up for our values, which we're not. I mean, anomalies and hypocrisies are, the U.S. foreign policy, I know from my own experiences, littered with hypocrisies and contradictions and many inconsistencies. It would be nice to think that human rights and even the support and promotion of democracy figures centrally in American foreign policy, but in no administration I ever worked for was that the case. And it certainly isn't now. It's a balance. You mentioned Egypt. We're going to get to Saudi Arabia and Syria in a minute. One other big picture question I wanted to ask you, and that is the notion of our partners, by, with, and through the leaders with whom we cooperate and depend on in the region. Do we have allies in the Middle East, or do we have partners? If an ally is a country with which we share common interests and values, how would you best describe countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and even the Israelis, where there's a high coincidence of interests and values, but certainly by no means is that across the board with respect to American interests. So how do you look at our partners? Because our partners are critically important in the achievements of our objectives and our policies.
Aaron, I love talking to you because you've done this work and you recognize the complexity of it. And I think trying to paint broad categories, let me just give you an experience. Look, if an ally is defined in the dictionary definition as a treaty ally, that's one thing.
Right.
An ally is defined as a state cooperating with another in military or other affairs. Let me just give you an example. When we had the Afghanistan crisis and we had to bring out what became well over 100,000 Afghans, myself and others called every capital in the Gulf and said, we're asking your permission to use your facilities to bring out, we don't know how many Afghans, and they'll be in your country for an indefinite period of time. We don't know. And they all said yes. And the reason we were able to execute that mission was because of our partners in the Gulf. So I would call those allies. I mean, that is something that you need. And frankly, it was harder to get some cooperation from some treaty allies. So it was the nature of international affairs with every country, whether a treaty ally, partner, however you want to define it, you're going to have agreements and disagreements. When the UAE is facing a missile attack, the first phone call is to us in the middle of the night. And we're immediately coordinating from the military level to the diplomatic level on down. So, however you want to define it, I would call these countries allies in that respect. We have also tremendous disagreements with our friends and partners in the Gulf. And in Israel, I mean, Joe Biden has said it before, a first principle of his is the security of Israel. And it's something that obviously we focus on every day. We just had another strategic consultation meeting with the Israelis yesterday. It is a daily endeavor for us and axiomatic.
I only raise this issue, Brett, because partners and allies, the relationships work best when there's reciprocity, when each country respects the interests of the other. And that raises the whole question of American leverage. How do we use American leverage in situations where we need to cooperate because our interests are involved, our material, tactical, or strategic interests, and yet when our values are undermined by the very countries with which we're cooperating? And it's a very difficult line, impossible line, I would argue, to walk unless you want to break a lot of crockery. And for example, in the case of Egypt or Saudi Arabia, see values as a more important proposition than interests. And that no administration, I think, has been prepared to do. But we're going to get back to the issue of Saudi Arabia in a minute. Let's take a little regional tour. Let's start with Iran. I know Middle East negotiations have only two speeds, slow and slower. But your friend and mine, former colleague of mine, your current colleague, Rob Malley, is in Vienna still, I think. How would you describe the state? We'll get to the fate of the negotiations in a minute, but how would you describe the state of the Iran negotiations in Vienna on January 27th?
Yeah, Aaron, Rob is in Vienna. I just spoke with him this morning. On this issue, I do think it's important to back up. And I know we have limited time, but it's important to back up. And I just saw Ghazi Eisenkot said just recently, I read it this morning, the former chief of the Israel Defense Forces, that the last administration's decision to get out of the JCPOA was a strategic mistake. And it led to an unshackled Iranian nuclear program. And I just go back and read where we were at the end of a couple months before we walked in here, in say December 2020. We had 24 rockets falling at our embassy in Baghdad. We were flying B-52 bombers from continental United States to the Middle East and back as shows of force. We had Iran enriching uranium to 20%. This is something that we inherited from that decision, and we're not placing blame. That's not our job. This is on our watch. This is our responsibility. But this problem is not one that we should be having, because the JCPOA, whatever you want to say about it, it did put a cabin on Iran's nuclear program through 2031. But where we are right now, given the advances of Iran's nuclear program, and it was predicted when that decision was made by some that Iran would never dare restart its nuclear program. I think anyone who knows Iran, who's dealt with the Iranians, who's looked at it, would have said that's actually the opposite of what's going to happen. So we're now on the verge of a nuclear crisis because Iran's program has advanced. Even as it has faced tremendous setbacks, it continues to advance. And it's getting to the point where the breakout time, the time at which it would have enough fissile material to be able to divert material for a weapons program, and we could not detect it, or inspectors could not detect it, we're starting to approach that window. So this is an extremely serious situation. At the same time, as Secretary Blinken and others have said repeatedly, these talks will have a culmination point, and we're actually reaching that culmination point pretty soon. And we're going to know very soon whether or not it is possible for the Iranians to return to compliance with the nuclear deal on terms that we and the international community can accept. So I'll just say, Aaron, we have over the last year, we reunited the P5+1. The Iranians have been surprised by the united front that they have hit, especially the new Raisi regime. And we're basically now in the negotiations back to where we were at the end of last summer, which means there's a chance for a deal. And there's also a pretty good chance there's not going to be a deal. And I will tell you, we are prepared for either scenario.
Right.
If there's no deal, we're very prepared for that scenario.
Is the less for less approach viable in your view? That is to say, if you can't get a full return to compliance and lifting of sanctions, which is a complicated issue, I'll get to that in a minute. Is it conceivable in order to preempt, constrain, create some sort of bridge to accept less for less Iranian compliance on the nuclear side for less removal of sanctions?
I mean, less for less, I've always thought that was a somewhat pejorative way to say, if there's a way to put a ceiling on their nuclear advances for limited sanctions relief to buy time, perhaps. But
right.
we're very much focused on return to full compliance with the JCPOA.
Okay.
Because that is what I think gives us in the international community comfort that this program is not going to break out.
I know this is a tough question to ask you, but I will. Wall Street Journal and Reuters have reported in recent days the departure of Richard Nephew, who frankly was going to forget more about sanctions that certainly than I'm ever going to know. Do you have any explanation? Is there a reason for that departure. Some have argued that there is a serious break between those who are arguing for a tougher approach on sanctions and those who are not. Can you shed any light on this?
No, I mean, look, Richard is an incredibly talented teammate, and he's taking a new position at the State Department. So it's a pretty intense environment. You've been on negotiating teams. It's a pretty intense 12 months. But I think Richard's going to a new position at the State Department. I mean, the negotiating team is the intelligence community, Department of Energy, Treasury. It's a pretty large, multifaceted team. I would say, I'm going to just give you an example of how this played out. When the RISI team came back to talks in December, they walked in the door with all sorts of walking back everything that had been done over the course of the summer in the former administration of Rouhani. And we had a choice. Do we just walk away from the table? In fact, what happened was the Iranians met a united front, not only the E3, but also the Russians. The rial collapsed. The Iranian currency collapsed to an all-time low. And the Iranians came back a week later with completely different proposals. So, that in my view is pretty good diplomacy. We're in the ballpark of a possible deal. But again, I'm not going to put odds on this. There's a very good chance these talks collapse very soon, and then we're going to shift to something else. We're ready for that.
Let's move on to Syria, a long time and long-term interest of yours. Human rights activists and hawks are hammering the administration because they believe that our policy toward the Assad regime has fundamentally changed, or in essence, we've accepted reality that Assad has managed with Iranian and Russian help to consolidate his power, and that we have not formally accepted him and may never, but we've acquiesced in others' efforts to bring him back from the cold, so to speak. What is the Biden administration's policy now on the Assad regime? We're well beyond the Obama Assad must go talking points, I suspect. But what is your thinking here, and on how the Emiratis, the Jordanians, just about everyone is in the Arab world has begun to reconcile?
Look, we do not support normalization with the Assad regime. We are never going to normalize with the Assad regime. We've been very clear with that on the record behind closed doors. Again, this is a trend. UAE and Bahrain reopened their embassies 2 or 3 years ago. This is a trend that has been ongoing. And I think if you travel around the region, the views on Syria are pretty consistent from capitals all around the region and Israel, which obviously we consult very closely with. And they have recognized the reality of the conflict as it exists now and are trying to protect and pursue their interests. That's what's happening in the region. We have focused on, we did a pretty comprehensive review of Syria, and we've really focused on 3 core issues at the top. Number one, Aaron, is the humanitarian situation, which evolved to an all-time low. And we worked to the first unanimous UN Security Council resolution to reauthorize humanitarian aid into northwest Syria. It's something that's ongoing. Number 2, we want to keep ceasefires in place in Syria because the main civil war violence is at an all-time low, even though it can still be too high. We want to keep major military offensives are over. In fact, we have assurances, and we'll see, we're trying to hold them, that the era of major military offensives in Syria is over. The war phase is basically over. We want to keep that intact. Third, importantly, the ISIS Al-Qaeda challenge in Syria remains real. That is why we are there. That's why we have U.S. forces on the ground. That's going to continue. And we're also accountability for the Assad regime and its atrocities, fully supportive of efforts in European courts and elsewhere to hold former regime officials accountable. We have increased sanctions on Assad regime officials who are involved in human rights abuses, and that's something that's going to continue. And finally, looking for opportunities through the UN-mediated process to find a political resolution to the overall situation in Syria. So that's what we're doing. Just doing that alone takes an awful lot of effort, and I think we have it pitched about right. But I agree, you're not going to make everybody happy. But I think that reflects not only the views of partners around the region, including very close partners, and the situation on the ground. In terms of discussions between capitals and Damascus, if Jordan, a neighbor, wants to have a discussion about border security with Syria, I mean, obviously we're not going to say no. That's very different than normalization with the Assad regime. And I think we try to draw that distinction when we have these conversations.
Right. I mean, I think your policy towards Syria is following this sort of transactional rather than transformational objectives that you've identified. Is as you describe it. I mean, a political settlement in Syria would require intense cooperation with Russia and Iran, and I think that's not right now on anybody's bandwidth. One additional point on Syria: the New York Times reports that we have around 900 troops deployed, several hundred near the Jordanian-Syrian border, and the bulk at Hasaka. The logic of that troop deployment is anti-ISIS. Is any of it related to Iran's presence in Syria, or is it primarily a counterterrorism mission? Well, that may be.
No. Thanks, Brad. We're in Syria together with partners, and there's still a coalition of 83 countries focused on ISIS, and that is why we're there. That's our legal basis. That's the reason. That's the basis for a coalition and having partners. And we're there for ISIS. And I think if you look at the situation in Hasaka over the last week, and the attempted prison break, and our forces lent assistance to the Syrian Democratic Forces to retake the prison from ISIS fighters. And just as a reminder, ISIS remains a very serious threat. That is why we're there. And that is the only reason we're there. At the same time, we will defend our forces from all threats. And we've made that very clear to the Iranians and others. But that is why we're there. And I should say one more thing before leaving Syria, of course. Syria and the activities of the Iranians in the IRGC remain a real threat, in particular to Israel. And we support Israel's freedom of action in Syria because it's essential to defending themselves. And frankly, there are a lot of signs that the Russians and the Assad regime also are kind of sick and tired of some of these IRGC activities inside Syria. But we support Israel's freedom of action, and we will defend our people, period. And the Iranians know that, and everybody on the ground in Syria knows that. But the mission of our forces is the counter-ISIS mission. That's the only mission, the only objective.
Thanks for clarifying that. Saudi Arabia, the president as candidate had some very tough words, promised I don't know if he used the term reassessment, which has a special meaning and character in the Middle East, but it may be a reevaluation of U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia. Has that happened? And if in fact it has happened, how would you differentiate the Biden administration's policy towards Saudi Arabia? You might describe the Saudis as an ally. From the previous administration's policies towards Saudi Arabia?
I'd say one thing with our approach, generally speaking, in the region, we don't give any blank checks to anybody. So our conversations in capitals, diplomatic and otherwise, I think, are very frank and direct. And when it comes to Saudi Arabia, this is a historic partnership that is going to endure. And in order to do anything in this part of the world, I think you have to be able to work very closely with the Saudis. At the same time, we have discussed with the Saudis from the top down, and the president had a call with King Salman early in the administration. There have been exchanges of letters and other very senior level dialogue about our concerns with Saudi Arabia, and in particular, the fact that in Congress, Saudi Arabia has really lost support of both political parties. And it's something that is very dangerous for any country because you have to try to maintain that level of support. Now, that said, we have made very clear we are committed fundamentally to helping Saudi Arabia defend its sovereign territory and its sovereign space. The defense of Saudi Arabia is a fundamental, very important interest of ours and something we're working on every day. And this gets into Yemen. I mean, the Yemen conflict, sometimes I think when we have discussions with Yemen, particularly with interested members of Congress, the conflict is locked in the paradigm of 2015, 16, 17. Over the last year, the Saudis have supported The UN initiatives, first led by Martin Griffiths, now by Hans Grundberg, initiatives to wind down the war. The Houthis have answered those initiatives by launching a massive offensive inside Yemen against the town of Marib. I want to focus on this for a minute because it's important. Marib is where basically all the displaced people, Yemenis who do not want to live under the Houthis, whose motto is death to Israel, death to America, curse the Jews. I can't blame Yemenis now for wanting to live under the Houthis. There's about 1.5 million displaced people in Marib. And over last year, the Houthis have refused to give up this massive military offensive to take Marib. They haven't succeeded. There have been a number of ceasefire initiatives on the table. The Houthis have refused to engage. The Houthis have launched missiles and UAVs repeatedly at Saudi Arabia, targeting, according to expert panels from the UN Security Council, civilian areas. So this is the current situation. And we're working, Tim Linderking is in the region right now, talking with the Saudis, the Emiratis, he's in Oman talking to others, to try to find a way to get this conflict to a ceasefire. But as President Biden said during his press conference last week when he was asked about Yemen, it takes two to get to a ceasefire and end the war. And right now the onus is on the Houthis. That's just
it does, and right, and the prospects of a broader settlement in Yemen are just beyond, I think, anyone's capacity to imagine. But we're also dealing with a very problematic Saudi partner. I mean, let's be clear. You've got a would-be king who is both reckless and has proven his ruthlessness over time. And here's where the value proposition, I think, becomes important. I agree that the Saudis are an important partner for the United States, but and the Houthis deserve their fair share of responsibility for the humanitarian disaster in Yemen, but so in essence do the Saudis and the Emiratis as well, having gotten out of the war, appear to be re-engaging to some degree. I don't envy Tim's prospects and the mission that he's got. Let's move on. We're running out of time. I won't belabor the point on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. The problem of the much too promised land is going to remain a problem for a very long time to come. But if you had to rank dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the broader Abraham Accords seem to be succeeding in many respects. If you had to rank the Israeli-Palestinian issue in a list of priorities of the administration, since governing is about choosing, where would you put this issue?
I think you're trying to ensure that the embers of potential conflict are dampened, so we don't have the risk of a breakout of another conflict, is a top tier priority. And I think we had the Gaza conflict in May, which I mentioned earlier, which again had all the ingredients to last for months. And President Biden was directly hands-on engaged in that over 11 days. And the conflict wound down in 11 days. And of course, since then, the work with Egypt, with Qatar, with the Israelis, with others, to try to make sure the situation in Gaza, the conditions for a re-flare-up are not there. At the same time, similarly in the West Bank, Jake Sullivan and I were just in Israel and visited Ramallah just before Christmas, trying to ensure that situation also. The embers of conflict, that there's no unilateral actions taken by anybody that can give extremists and Hamas and others a potential can spark a conflict. That is a top tier priority. That said, we support a two-state solution. We're trying to create a political horizon, and there's a new dialogue ongoing between individuals with Bennett government, from Minister Gantz and the Foreign Minister Lapid, with the Palestinian Authority, trying to see what's there to create a foundation, while also, again, being realistic. And I guess back to my first principle, we're not going to set expectations that are unlikely to be met. As you know better than anybody, this is incredibly complex. It is interwoven with multiple interests. And I think as Americans, we have to approach it with some humility and not coming in with some master plan, but working from the bottom up to try to create the conditions so the conflict can't break out. And over time, begin to establish an important political horizon, which has to be set. So it's a daily part of our work, and trying to reduce the risk of a conflict flaring up is a top tier priority. In terms of an actual peace process, I just don't think we're there yet. But we have a lot of folks working on it to try to get the foundations in place to move.
I mean, I take your point. With respect to the three major breakthroughs in the Arab-Israeli conflict, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Israel, Palestinians, Israel, at least when there was an Oslo process that was functioning, all of those breakthroughs occurred without the presence of the United States. It is instrumental and instructive that unless the Israelis and Palestinians own their own negotiations, it's extremely difficult for the United States to expect to play a brokering role. But what do we do about helping the Israelis and Palestinians create an environment in which those negotiations can take place? That involves some very difficult choices and some potential conflicts, particularly with the Israelis, over issues like settlement activities, land confiscation, and with the Palestinians with respect to incitement, corruption, and the perennial problem of what you do with the divided Palestinian leadership. I suspect a two-state solution isn't available now. What you've got is a three-state solution. Israel, Hamas enclave in Gaza, and what remains of Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Another problem that isn't ready or ripe for resolution. The great powers. The conventional wisdom in Washington and elsewhere is that an American vacuum has enabled China and Russia to play a much more important and consequential role in the region. And some would argue they're simply eating our lunch from one end of the region to the other. I don't share that view, but how do you process Chinese and Russian involvement in the region?
I hadn't seen that quote. I think that's quite overstated. We are, first of all, we're the security partner of choice across the region. I think that's something that is going to maintain. Again, when a country comes under missile attack, and rightfully so, we're the first call, and we're there immediately. Look, this has been, again, something we inherited. I wasn't surprised by too many things walking in the door, but I actually was surprised by a few of the inroads the Chinese had made in certain areas. And we have had a very close dialogue with our friends across the region about certain activities that would jeopardize the level of American cooperation. And that is something that is ongoing. So in terms of economic partnerships, trade, commerce, that's something that's going to be there. Number one trading partner. I mean, that's something that is obviously ongoing. But when it comes to certain activities, technology, military cooperation, that is when there are very serious issues at stake. And I would just say over the last year, my fellow coordinator here at the NSC, Kirk Campbell, I think our teams are pretty interwoven. And in having a dialogue with countries in the Middle East about what China's actual ambitions are and what this project actually means. It might be under the guise of a commercial project, but it's actually something quite different. That's something that I think we have had a very good dialogue and a bit of an awakening, I think, from some of our partners in the Middle East region about this issue. And that's something that is ongoing. The Russians is kind of a different story. Obviously, the Russian intervention in Syria was significant. They're there. They've been in Syria. They were in Syria, the Cold War. You read Martin Indyck's book about Henry Kissinger, you get a taste of that. So there's nothing in particularly new. But that's also something that we deal with. But we find ways to work with the Russians where we can. But, we have tremendous differences. So that's something that's not going to change. But I do not see any of our partners saying, you know what? I think the Chinese will have our back in the next conflict. So we're going to go to China, not the Americans. That's really not where this is heading.
No, on the security issue, I think you're right. Although there is some hedging going on. It seems to be conventional wisdom in the region that the U.S. is somehow deprioritizing the Middle East. But again, last question. We're actually out of time, but looking out at 2022, Brett, what is the single most important issue that keeps you up at night? Is there one more than any other?
I'm inclined to give Jim Mattis's answer. It's our job to keep others up at night, and that is part of our job. But I will say, obviously, the safety and security of our personnel in harm's way. I've spent a lot of time in these areas, including in war zones. Our diplomats, our military personnel, our men and women out there, that's something that is fundamental to us. I think our first read in the morning, every morning, is threats and making sure our people have what they need to defend themselves and protect themselves. So that is really fundamental and vital. And the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran is something that would keep anyone up at night, but I can assure you that is never going to happen, one way or the other. We think diplomacy is the best way to pursue that course, but that is an outcome that we will never see, and we are committed to that. So I'll leave it there. But I want to keep others up.
Brett McGurk, I want to thank you for sharing your time and your thoughts and your views. It may well be the most broken, angry, dysfunctional region in the world today, most conflict-ridden, but I'm glad you're working on it. So again, thanks so much for coming, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. Think positive and test negative.
Honored to be with you, Aaron. Thank you so much.
Take care, Brett.